Sometimes the hardest part of loss isn't saying goodbye, it's learning how to live with what's left behind. Nate Coleman knew that feeling all too well. At 45, recently divorced and mourning his father's death, he had stopped expecting anything good to happen. Then, one morning, an injured baby crow showed up on his fence. He tried to shoo it away, but it kept coming back. So Nate gave in and built it a shelter. He named the bird Pip. Weeks passed, and Pip started bringing him small gifts, a button, a key, an old coin. Then one day, Pip brought him something different, something that would lead Nate back to a moment in his father's life he never knew existed. Why would a bird go looking for pieces of the past? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story resonates with you, subscribe. Tomorrow's story is one you won't want to miss. The Oregon coast in late October carried a particular kind of melancholy. Nate Coleman stood on his back porch, coffee mug warming his hands, watching fog roll in from the Pacific. His craftsman-style house sat 3 blocks from the water in the small town of Bayfield, a place where everyone knew your business and most people had the decency to pretend they didn't. The yard before him told the story of the past year better than words could. Grass grown shaggy and wild, flower beds choked with weeds, the fence listing slightly to one side where a post had rotted through. Nate kept meaning to fix it. He kept meaning to do a lot of things. 3 months since his father's funeral, 6 months since the divorce papers were signed. The numbers marked time but didn't capture the weight of either event, how they'd settled into his bones, making even simple tasks feel insurmountable. Harold Coleman had died of a heart attack at 72, sudden and efficient. The funeral had been small, attended mostly by other retired postal workers and a handful of neighbors. Nate had stood beside the casket, feeling like a stranger at someone else's grief. He and his father had never been close, not in the warm, back-slapping way he'd seen other fathers and sons interact. Harold had been distant, cordial, present in body but absent in all the ways that mattered. Nate had spent his whole childhood trying to crack that reserve, to find some way in. He'd brought home good grades, played baseball because Harold mentioned once that he'd played in high school, learned carpentry thinking they might build something together. Harold would nod, offer a brief, good job, then retreat to whatever private space he occupied in his own mind. The divorce had been quieter than the marriage, which was saying something. Claire had been patient for 15 years, waiting for Nate to fully show up in their life together. When she finally stopped waiting, her voice had been gentle but firm. "You're not really here, Nate. You haven't been for years. I don't think you know how to be." She'd moved to Portland, 2 hours north. Their daughter Zoe had chosen to go with her, not because she preferred her mother, she'd insisted, but because Portland had better schools, more opportunities. Nate had agreed too quickly, relief and guilt mixing in equal measure. He saw Zoe every other weekend, visits that felt choreographed and stiff, both of them trying too hard to pretend things were normal. Now he lived alone in a house that echoed, working as a freelance carpenter when he could muster the energy. His workshop behind the house held half-finished projects, a bookshelf with 3 shelves left to cut, a rocking chair that needed sanding, a jewelry box he'd started for Zoe's 16th birthday 2 months ago, and still hadn't completed. He took a sip of coffee, now lukewarm, and that's when he saw it. A crow sat on the fence rail, listing slightly to one side. Even from 20 feet away, Nate could see something was wrong with its right wing. The wing hung at an odd angle, dragging against the weathered wood. The bird's head swiveled toward him, black eyes remarkably bright. It made no sound, just watched with an intensity that felt almost human. Nate turned away, heading back inside. He had enough problems without adding an injured bird to the list. Nature would take its course, a cat, a raccoon, or simple exposure would handle it. That's how things worked. But the next morning, the crow was still there. Same spot on the fence, wing still dragging. It had survived the night somehow. Nate stood at the kitchen window, coffee in hand, studying the bird. It turned its head, met his gaze through the glass. He looked away first. By the third morning, Nate's resolve had weakened. The crow had moved to a fence post closer to the house, as if understanding that proximity might equal safety. Its feathers looked rumpled, dull. The wing hadn't improved. Mrs. Hendricks from next door appeared at her own fence, pruning shears in hand, though nothing in her yard needed pruning this time of year. "That crow's been watching you," she called over. "3 days now." Nate stepped onto the porch. "Just injured. Probably won't last long." Mrs. Hendricks was 78, sharp as a tack, and had lived in Bayfield her entire life. She studied the bird with interest. "Crows are smart. You know, they remember faces. Hold grudges too if you wrong them, but if you help one, they remember that as well." "I'm not helping it." "No?" She raised an eyebrow. "Then why are you standing out here looking at it?" Nate had no answer for that. Mrs. Hendricks smiled, gentle rather than mocking. "My grandmother used to say crows are messengers, between this world and the next. Never could figure if she meant it literally or just poetically, but she swore they knew things people didn't. I don't believe in that kind of thing. Most people don't, until they do." She returned to her unnecessary pruning. "Either way, that bird's decided something about you. Be interesting to see what you decide about it." That afternoon, Nate found himself in his workshop, not working on any of the abandoned projects, but building something new, a small shelter, barely more than a box with a slanted roof and an open front. Simple construction, the kind of thing he could complete in an hour. He told himself he was just keeping his hands busy, that it meant nothing. He placed the shelter on the porch railing, wedged it secure, then filled a shallow dish with water and scattered some seeds he'd found in the back of a cupboard, probably left over from a bird feeder. Claire had bought years ago that never got hung. The crow watched the entire operation from its fence post. "There," Nate said, feeling foolish for speaking out loud. "That's all I'm doing. Rest is up to you." He went inside, deliberately not looking back. But the next morning, the crow had moved into the shelter. It sat tucked in the back corner, wing still damaged but eyes bright and alert. The water was gone, most of the seeds eaten. Nate refilled both. The day after that, he found himself researching crow rehabilitation online. Most sites said injured wild birds should be taken to wildlife centers. The nearest one was 40 miles away. Nate looked at the crow. It looked back at him. "You're not going to let me catch you anyway, are you?" The crow tilted its head as if considering the question. Over the following week, a routine established itself. Nate would bring fresh water and seeds each morning. The crow would eat, drink, and watch him with those unnerving, intelligent eyes. Gradually, the wing began to improve. The droop became less pronounced. The bird started stretching it, testing the range of motion. On the 8th day, Nate sat on the porch steps, coffee in hand, watching dawn break over the fog. The crow hopped out of its shelter, onto the railing, then down to the porch floor. It moved closer, cautious but deliberate, until it stood maybe 3 feet away. "You need a name," Nate heard himself say. "Can't keep calling you the crow." The bird cocked its head. "Pip," Nate decided. The word had come from nowhere, or maybe from everywhere, from the memory of Zoe's childhood stuffed animal, a little penguin she'd named Pip and carried everywhere until she was 7. The crow made a soft sound, almost conversational. For the first time in months, Nate felt something other than the constant low-grade numbness that had become his baseline. Not happiness, exactly, but something, a small crack in the wall he'd built around himself, letting in a thin sliver of light. 2 weeks passed, and Pip's wing healed completely. The crow could fly now short distances at first, then longer sweeps across the yard and into neighboring trees. But it never left. Each evening it returned to the shelter, and each morning Nate found it waiting on the porch railing. Nate had stopped questioning the arrangement. He'd also stopped pretending he didn't look forward to those morning moments with coffee and bird, the quiet companionship that demanded nothing. Then one Thursday morning, he found something new. A small object sat on the porch railing beside the shelter. Nate picked it up, turning it over in his palm. A silver button, tarnished with age, stamped with an anchor design. The kind of button that might come from a uniform, though he couldn't say what kind. He looked at Pip, who watched him with those bright, knowing eyes. "Did you bring this?" The crow tilted its head, made a soft clicking sound. Nate pocketed the button, dismissing it as coincidence. Crows were notorious collectors of shiny things. It probably came from someone's trash or a jacket lost in the park. But on Monday, another gift appeared. A small key, rusty and worn, the kind that might open a padlock or a diary. It sat in the exact same spot as the button had been. Wednesday brought an old coin, so worn the date was barely legible. 1,979, maybe. The face nearly smooth. Nate sat on the porch steps that evening, examining the three objects. Button, key, coin. Random items, certainly. Yet something about them felt deliberate. The way they'd been placed, always in the same location. The timing, too, always when he was inside, never while he watched. He pulled out his phone and searched, "Do crows bring gifts to humans?" The results surprised him. Multiple articles, research papers, documented cases. Crows did indeed bring gifts to people who fed them, who showed them kindness. Shiny objects, mostly bottle caps, bits of glass, coins, jewelry. Ornithologists called it reciprocal altruism. The crows understood debt, gratitude, relationship. That Saturday, Zoe came for her weekend visit. At 16, she carried herself with the careful poise of someone navigating divorced parents and teenage social politics in equal measure. She'd grown 3 inches since summer, all legs and elbows, her dark hair cut shorter than Nate remembered. They made awkward small talk over takeout pizza. School was fine, her friends were fine, Portland was fine, everything was fine, wrapped in a politeness that hurt more than anger would have. "Mom's seeing someone," Zoe said finally, picking pepperoni off her slice. "A guy named Frank. He's nice, I guess." "That's good," Nate said, meaning it. Claire deserved happiness. "I'm glad she's happy." Zoe studied him. "Are you? Happy, I mean?" The question landed heavy. Nate looked out the kitchen window toward the porch, where Pip sat preening in the fading light. "I'm working on it," he said. Later, as they cleaned up, Zoe noticed the 3 objects lined up on the windowsill. "What are these?" "The crow brings them." "Gifts, apparently." Zoe picked up the button, examining it. "That's actually pretty cool. The anchor's really detailed." She paused. "You know, I wish I'd known Grandpa Harold better, before he died." The comment caught Nate off guard. "What do you mean?" "I don't know. He was just always so quiet. We never really talked about anything real. And now he's gone, and I realized I don't know any stories about him. What he was like when he was young, or how he met Grandma, or anything." Nate felt the observation settle uncomfortably. He didn't have many stories either. Harold had been present physically there for meals and holidays and occasional baseball games, but had never offered much about himself. His childhood, his past, his inner life had remained locked away. "He was a private person," Nate offered, the same explanation he'd always used. "But you're his son. You must know something." The truth was, Nate knew remarkably little. Harold Coleman had worked for the Postal Service for 35 years. He'd married Patricia Reynolds in 1982. They'd had 1 child, Nate, in 1981. Patricia had died of cancer 10 years ago. Harold had lived alone afterward, declining Nate's offers to move closer, maintaining his small apartment and his routines until his heart gave out. Basic facts, the skeleton of a life without flesh or breath. After Zoe left Sunday afternoon, the house felt emptier than usual. Nate stood at the kitchen window, looking at the button, the key, the coin. Random objects, meaningless. Except, Monday morning brought another gift from Pip, this time not random at all. A pendant lay on the railing, oval-shaped, made of weathered brass, hung from a broken chain. Nate picked it up with trembling fingers, turning it over to reveal an inscription on the back, partially worn but still legible. Always. The rest had been rubbed away by time or wear, but those fragments remained. Always. And an initial, H. Nate's chest tightened. He knew this pendant, or rather, he'd seen it before, in some half-remembered moment. The shape was familiar, the weight of it in his palm. He looked at Pip. "Where did you find this?" The crow hopped along the railing, agitated or excited, Nate couldn't tell which. That evening, Nate stood in his garage, staring at the stack of boxes he'd been avoiding for 3 months. His father's belongings, packed hastily after the funeral, shoved into storage because dealing with them felt impossible. He opened the first box, clothes mostly. The second held books, reading glasses, a few DVDs. The third contained papers, bills, tax documents, the detritus of an ordinary life. In the fourth box, wrapped in a faded towel, Nate found a brass compass. The case was tarnished, the glass face cracked, but when he opened it, the needle still swung true. Engraved on the inside of the case were initials H.C., not H.R. for Harold Coleman. H.C. for something else. Nate set the compass aside, digging deeper. Old photographs he'd never seen. His father, young, impossibly young, in what looked like a naval uniform. Nate hadn't known Harold served in the Navy. It had never come up, never been mentioned. In the photo, Harold stood beside a woman Nate didn't recognize. She had dark hair and bright eyes, and Harold's arm was around her shoulders. They both smiled, truly smiled, with the kind of joy Nate had never seen on his father's face. He flipped the photo over, written in faded ink, "Helen and Harold, 1978, San Diego. Helen, H." Nate's hands shook as he kept searching. At the bottom of the box, he found something that made his breath catch. A small metal lockbox, dull grey, secured with a simple padlock. He pulled the rusty key from his pocket, the one Pip had brought days ago. It fit perfectly. The lock opened with a soft click that seemed too loud in the quiet garage. Nate sat on the concrete floor, the lockbox in his lap, suddenly afraid of what he might find inside. He lifted the lid slowly. Letters. Dozens of them, tied together with string that had yellowed with age. Beneath them, more photographs. And underneath everything, official-looking papers with military seals. Nate pulled out the top photograph. His father, maybe 25 years old, stood on the deck of a ship in full naval dress uniform. The same woman from the other photo, Helen, stood beside him, wearing a sundress and squinting into bright sunlight. Harold's hand rested on her shoulder, and the expression on his face was one Nate had never witnessed. Unguarded happiness. He turned the photo over. Helen and Harold, 1978, San Diego again, but this time with more written below. The day we knew. Knew what? Nate stared at his father's young face, trying to reconcile this smiling stranger with the quiet, distant man who'd raised him. The military papers told him things he'd never known. Harold Coleman had enlisted in the Navy in 1975, served for 5 years, received an honorable discharge in 1980. 5 years of his father's life that had never been mentioned, never referenced. Nate had grown up believing Harold had always been a postal worker, always lived in Oregon, always been exactly what he appeared to be. With trembling fingers, Nate untied the string, holding the letters together. The paper was brittle, the ink faded but still legible. He opened the first one. "My dearest Harold," it began, "San Diego feels empty without you. I know it's only been 3 days, but I already miss your voice, your laugh, the way you look at me, like I'm the only person in the world." The letter was dated June 1978. It went on for 2 pages, filled with longing and plans for the future. Helen wrote about the apartment they'd looked at together, about wanting children someday, about growing old with him. The words were intimate, full of a love so tangible it made Nate's chest ache. He opened another letter, then another. Months of correspondence between his father and this woman named Helen. Their relationship had been serious, committed. They'd planned to marry after Harold's discharge. Nate set the letters aside and pulled out more photographs. Helen and Harold at the beach, at a restaurant, in what looked like a small apartment, Helen laughing at something off camera while Harold gazed at her with open adoration. His father had been capable of this, of joy, of unguarded love. The man who'd remained emotionally distant through Nate's entire childhood had once been someone completely different. But who was Helen, and what had happened to her? Nate's mother, the woman who'd raised him, had been named Patricia Reynolds Coleman. They'd married in 1982, according to the certificate Nate had seen dozens of times. She died of cancer in 2015, leaving Harold alone for the final 9 years of his life. But these letters were dated 1978 to 1980, years before his parents' marriage. Nate dug through the box again, looking for answers. Near the bottom, he found what he was looking for and what he'd been dreading. A newspaper clipping, carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve. The headline read, "Fatal Accident Claims Young Woman." The article was dated the 18th of December 1981. Helen Marie Cordova, 25, of Seattle, died Thursday evening from injuries sustained in a motor vehicle accident. Cordova was a passenger in a vehicle that was struck by a drunk driver at the intersection of Pine and Broadway. The driver of Cordova's vehicle, Harold Coleman, sustained minor injuries. Cordova was transported to Seattle General Hospital, where she was pronounced dead 3 days later. She is survived by her parents, Carlos and Miriam Cordova of Portland. Nate read the article 3 times, trying to process what it meant. Helen had died in 1981, Harold had been driving, had survived while she hadn't. 1 year later, Harold had married Patricia. The timeline clicked into place with sickening clarity. His father had lost the woman he loved in a terrible accident. A year later, he'd married someone else, Nate's mother, perhaps seeking comfort, perhaps trying to move forward, perhaps unable to bear being alone with his grief. But the question that burned in Nate's mind was simpler and more painful. Had Harold ever truly loved Patricia? Or had she been a replacement, a second choice, someone to help him survive the loss of his first love? Morning light was filtering through the garage windows when Nate finally stood, his knees stiff from sitting on concrete for hours. He gathered the letters, the photographs, the newspaper clipping, and carried them into the house. Pip was waiting on the porch railing, as always. When Nate stepped outside, the crow hopped closer, making soft clicking sounds. "You knew," Nate said quietly. "Somehow you knew I needed to find these." The crow tilted its head, watching him with those impossibly intelligent eyes. Nate pulled out his phone and did something he almost never did. He called Zoe in the middle of a school day. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice hushed. "Dad, I'm in class. Is everything okay? I need to tell you something. About your grandfather. About our family." He paused, trying to find the right words. "I found some things. Letters, photographs, from before I was born. There's a lot I didn't know about him. Can it wait until this weekend?" "No," Nate said. "I don't think it can. When you come this Saturday, I need to show you. We need to figure this out together." There was a long pause. Then Zoe said, her voice different, more mature, more present. "Okay. I'll be there Friday after school instead. Mom won't mind if I tell her it's important." After they hung up, Nate went back inside and spread the contents of the lockbox across his kitchen table. Letters, photographs, official documents, and the newspaper clipping at the center of it all. Helen Marie Cordova, the woman his father had loved before Nate was born. The woman who died and left Harold broken in ways that apparently never healed. Nate picked up one of the later letters, dated November 1981, just a month before the accident. His hands froze as he read the first line. My darling Harold, I can't believe in just a few more months we'll be parents. Parents. The word hit like a physical blow. Helen had been pregnant. The accident hadn't just taken Harold's fiancée, it had taken their unborn child. Nate set the letter down carefully, as if it might shatter. His father had lost everything in one terrible moment. A woman he loved, a child he'd never meet, a future he'd planned. And a year later, he'd married Patricia, and somehow Nate had been born. The dates swam in his mind. December 1981, Helen dies. June 1982, Harold marries Patricia. But when was Nate born? He'd never thought to question it. His birthday was December 20th, 1981, 2 days after Helen's accident. Nate's vision blurred. It wasn't possible. He grabbed his phone and searched for his birth certificate. Found the photo he'd taken years ago when he needed it for a passport, zoomed in on the details. Name of mother, Patricia Reynolds Coleman. But that couldn't be right. Patricia and Harold hadn't married until June 1982, unless the certificate had been changed, unless Patricia hadn't been his biological mother at all, unless Helen's unborn child, the one mentioned in her letter, had somehow survived. Friday evening arrived with rain, steady and cold. Nate paced the living room, checking his phone every few minutes. Zoe had texted an hour ago that she was on the road, but the drive from Portland took longer in bad weather. When headlights finally swept across the front window, Nate was at the door before she could knock. Zoe stood on the porch, backpack over one shoulder, hair damp despite her hood. She looked at her father's face, and her expression shifted from teenage casualness to genuine concern. "Dad, you look terrible. Come in, please." She followed him to the kitchen, where the contents of the lockbox still covered the table. Zoe set down her backpack slowly, taking in the scattered photographs and letters. "What is all this?" "Sit down," Nate said. "I need to show you something." For the next hour, he walked her through everything he'd found. The photographs of Harold and Helen, the letters spanning years, the newspaper article about the accident, and finally, the letter dated November 1981 that mentioned Helen's pregnancy. Zoe listened without interrupting, her eyes moving from the documents to her father's face and back again. When he finished, she sat in silence for a long moment. "So you think," she said carefully, "that Grandpa Harold's girlfriend was pregnant when she died, and somehow you were born 2 days after the accident. I know how it sounds. Do you have your birth certificate?" Nate pulled it up on his phone, handed it to her. Zoe studied it, zooming in on the details. "Born Seattle General Hospital," she read. "December 20th, 1981. Mother, Patricia Reynolds Coleman." She looked up. "But they didn't get married until 1982. "Exactly. Maybe the certificate was amended after they got married? Like, legally updated? Maybe." Nate ran his hands through his hair. "Or maybe Patricia isn't my biological mother. Maybe I'm Helen's son." Zoe set the phone down, her expression thoughtful rather than shocked. "Dad, I need to tell you something. I've been working on this genealogy project for school, remember? Researching our family tree. You mentioned that. Well, I found something weird. I didn't want to say anything because I thought maybe I was reading it wrong or the records were messed up." She pulled out her own phone, opened a document. "Look at this." She showed him a screenshot of a birth announcement from a Seattle newspaper. December 1981. Baby boy born to Helen Cordova and Harold Coleman. Seattle General Hospital, December 20th. Mother and child are doing well. Nate stared at the screen. "Where did you find this?" "Online newspaper archives. I was searching for Grandpa Harold's name, trying to find information about his past. This came up, but it didn't make sense because your mom was Patricia, not Helen. I figured it was a different Harold Coleman, even though the date matched your birthday exactly. It's not a different Harold Coleman. No, Zoe said quietly. I don't think it is. She pulled up another document. And then I found this, an obituary for Helen Marie Cordova. Died December 18th, 1981, from injuries sustained in a motor vehicle accident. Survived by her parents, Carlos and Miriam Cordova. And listen to this part. Memorial services will be held at Riverview Chapel. In lieu of flowers, donations may be made to Seattle Children's Hospital in honor of Helen's infant son. The words hung in the air between them. Her infant son, Nate repeated. Yeah. Zoe's voice was gentle. Dad, I think you're Helen's baby. I think she gave birth after the accident and then died. And for some reason, Patricia ended up being listed as your mother on official documents. Nate sank into a chair, the weight of it crushing. His entire life, his entire identity, built on a foundation that wasn't real. Patricia Reynolds Coleman, the woman he'd called Mum, the woman who died when he was 34 years old. She hadn't been his biological mother. Did Mum know? Zoe asked. Patricia, I mean. She must have. They got married 6 months after Helen died. You don't just accidentally end up with someone else's infant. But why wouldn't they tell you? That was the question that hurt most. Why the secrecy? Why the deception? Harold had spent Nate's entire childhood keeping him at arm's length, maintaining that painful distance. Had it been because Nate reminded him of Helen? Because looking at his son meant confronting the woman he'd lost? Zoe reached across the table, covered her father's hand with hers. I brought something else, from Grandma Patricia's things. She dug in her backpack and pulled out a small photo album, worn at the edges. Mom gave this to me after Grandma died. She said it was stuff Grandma wanted me to have someday. Old family photos, mostly. But there's something in here I think you need to see. She flipped through pages until she found what she was looking for. A child's drawing, done in crayon, carefully preserved behind plastic. The figures were crude, the way children's art always is, stick figures with round heads and smiling faces. One tall figure labeled Daddy in shaky letters. One small figure labeled Me. At the top, in a child's careful printing, Daddy and Me, with a date written by an adult hand in the corner, June 1987. Nate would have been 5 years old. You wanted his attention, Zoe said softly. Even back then. Nate stared at the drawing, memory flooding back. He'd made that for Father's Day, had presented it to Harold with such pride, expecting praise, expecting to see that smile he'd seen in the photographs from San Diego. Harold had thanked him, put it on the refrigerator for exactly 1 day, then quietly removed it. Nate had found it weeks later in a drawer, forgotten. I tried so hard, Nate heard himself say. My whole childhood, I kept trying to figure out what I was doing wrong, why he didn't want to be close to me, why I could never make him happy. It wasn't about you, Dad. He was grieving. For 34 years, until the day he died. Nate's voice cracked. I was 7 years old when I found a photograph of Helen in his desk drawer. I asked him who the pretty lady was. He said, someone from a long time ago, and told me it didn't matter anymore. But it did matter. It mattered more than I did. Zoe squeezed his hand. That's not true, isn't it? He kept her memory alive in that lockbox while keeping me at a distance my entire life. And Mom Patricia, she knew. She knew she was raising another woman's child. Did she resent me for it? Is that why she always seemed so sad when she looked at me? I don't think she resented you. Zoe's voice was firm. I think she loved you. Whatever else was complicated, I think that was real. Outside, the rain had stopped. Through the kitchen window, Nate could see Pip perched on the porch railing, a dark silhouette against the evening sky. The crow brought me that pendant, Nate said. The one with, always, H, engraved on it. How did a bird know to look for pieces of my father's past? How did it know I needed to find all of this? Zoe followed his gaze to Pip. Mrs. Hendricks, your neighbor, she says. Crows are smart, really smart. Not that smart. Maybe. Zoe picked up one of Helen's letters, traced the faded handwriting with her finger. Or maybe some things don't have logical explanations. Maybe that's okay. Nate's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. He opened it, confused. Mr. Coleman, this is Iris Matheson. Your daughter found my contact information in Patricia's old address book and reached out to me. I was your mother's best friend from nursing school. I think we should talk. There are things about your parents you should know. Would tomorrow work for you? He showed the text to Zoe. You contacted her? I thought she might have answers. She was there when everything happened. She knew both of them. Nate looked at his daughter, this thoughtful, mature young woman who'd taken it upon herself to unravel family mysteries, who'd driven through rain to be here, who was holding his hand while his entire history came undone. When did you get so wise? He asked. I learned from watching you figure stuff out, Zoe said, even when it's hard. Iris Matheson lived in a modest ranch house on the outskirts of Bend, 3 hours inland from Bayfield. Nate and Zoe made the drive Saturday morning, leaving before dawn. Pip had insisted on coming, or at least that's how it felt. When Nate tried to leave without the bird, it had followed the truck to the end of the driveway, cawing insistently until Nate relented and found a small pet carrier in the garage. Now the crow sat in the back seat, quiet but alert, watching the landscape change from coastal forest to high desert. This is surreal, Zoe said, looking back at Pip. Taking a crow on a road trip to meet someone who knew your maybe not actually mother. Welcome to my week. They drove in comfortable silence, the kind that had been rare between them for years. Somewhere in the past 24 hours, something had shifted. Zoe wasn't just his daughter visiting on a custody schedule anymore. She was an ally, a partner in unraveling a mystery that affected them both. Iris Matheson answered the door before they could knock. She was in her 70s, small and trim, with silver hair pulled into a neat bun, and eyes that were kind but assessing. You're early, she said. Good. Come in. I made coffee. Her home was filled with photographs and books, the accumulated comfort of a long life. She led them to a sunlit living room where coffee and cookies waited on a low table. You can leave the bird in the carrier, Iris said, noticing Pip. Or let it out, if it won't make a mess. I've seen stranger things in my day. Nate opened the carrier door. Pip hopped out, surveyed the room with careful attention, then settled on the arm of the sofa near Nate. Iris studied the bird with interest. Patricia loved birds, used to feed the sparrows at the hospital during her breaks. She settled into her chair, coffee in hand. Your daughter said you found Harold's lockbox, the letters from Helen. Yes. And you've put together that Patricia wasn't your biological mother. Yes. Iris nodded slowly. Good. Saves me from having to figure out how to tell you. This conversation has been 43 years overdue. She sipped her coffee, gathering her thoughts. When she spoke, her voice was steady but weighted with old emotion. I met Patricia in 1976. We were both in nursing school at Portland State. She was brilliant, top of our class, dedicated, compassionate, everything you'd want in a nurse. Iris smiled at the memory. She'd dated Harold briefly in 1974, before he enlisted. Nothing serious, but she'd carried a torch for him after he left. Said he was different from other men. Quieter, deeper. She never mentioned that, Nate said. No, she wouldn't have. Patricia kept things close. Iris set down her coffee. Harold came back to the Northwest in late 1981. He'd been stationed in San Diego, met Helen there, fell completely in love. They were planning to marry after his discharge. Helen was pregnant, due in January. Everything was perfect. Her face clouded. Then came the accident. December 18th. Drunk driver ran a red light, hit the passenger side where Helen was sitting. She was rushed to Seattle General with massive internal injuries. The doctors performed an emergency C-section to save the baby. You, she said, looking at Nate. You were born 2 days early but healthy. Perfect. Nate's chest tightened. And Helen? She held on for 3 days. Long enough to see you, to hold you once. Patricia was working at Seattle General then. That's how she found out. She saw Harold in the maternity ward, absolutely shattered, holding this tiny baby, completely lost. Iris's eyes grew distant. Helen died December 21st. Harold was devastated in a way I've never seen before or since. He couldn't process it, couldn't function. He had an infant son and no idea how to care for you while drowning in grief and guilt. Guilt? He was driving. Logically, he knew it wasn't his fault. Witnesses confirmed the drunk driver was at fault, ran the light at high speed. But logic doesn't help much with survivor's guilt. Helen died, protecting your unborn body with hers. Harold walked away with bruises. That kind of thing destroys people. Zoe leaned forward. So Patricia helped. Patricia stepped in like an angel. She took a 6-month leave from her job, moved into Harold's apartment, took care of you while he tried to hold himself together. Iris's voice softened. She'd always loved him, remember? And here he was, broken and alone with a newborn. She wanted to help. It was supposed to be temporary. But it wasn't, Nate said. No. 6 months became a year. Patricia was essentially your mother in every way that mattered, feeding you, changing you, singing to you at night. Harold was physically present, but emotionally absent, trapped somewhere inside his grief. Iris stood, moved to a bookshelf, and pulled down a small box. Patricia asked me to keep these, said if anything happened to her, I should make sure you got them eventually. She handed the box to Nate. Inside were journals, 5 of them. Patricia's handwriting on the covers, dating from 1982 to 2015. She wanted you to understand, Iris said. Not right away, maybe, but someday. Nate opened the first journal, dated June 1982. The first entry was from the day Patricia married Harold. Today I married the man I've loved for years. He was honest with me from the start. His heart is broken, and he may never fully heal. He loves me, but not the way he loved Helen. I know this. I'm choosing this anyway. Because I love him, and I love Nate, and maybe love doesn't have to be equal to be real. The words blurred as Nate's eyes filled. He looked up at Iris. Why didn't she tell me? Why did the birth certificate list her as my mother? They amended it after the marriage, made it legal, made it official. Helen's parents wanted nothing to do with Harold or you. They blamed him for the accident. Wouldn't even come to Helen's funeral. Patricia legally adopted you to ensure you'd have full protection, full rights, and to give you a mother who was there, present, choosing you every day. Did she resent me? The question came out broken. Did she wish I was hers instead of Helen's? Iris moved to sit beside him. Took his hand. Read the journals. You'll see. Patricia never once resented you, but yes, she hurt. She spent 20 years loving a man who couldn't fully love her back, who looked at you and saw the woman he'd lost, who kept Helen's memory alive in ways that shut Patricia out. That's why he was so distant with me, Nate said. I looked like Helen. You have her eyes, her smile, even some of her mannerisms. Patricia wrote about it in the journals, how you'd tilt your head the same way Helen did in photographs, how it would make Harold retreat into himself. Zoe had been quiet, but now she spoke. Did Helen's parents really never want to meet Dad, their own grandson? Iris's expression darkened. Carlos and Miriam Cordova were destroyed by Helen's death, their only child gone. They blamed Harold with an intensity that was frightening. Patricia tried for years to mediate, to at least let them see you. Every attempt was rejected. They returned letters unopened, refused phone calls. They wanted nothing to do with either of you. Are they still alive? Carlos died in 2018, but Miriam is still living in Astoria, actually, not far from you at all. The revelation landed like a stone. My grandmother lives 40 minutes away, has for the past 15 years, moved there after Carlos died. Iris hesitated. I don't know if she'd want contact, Nate. 40 years is a long time to hold on to anger, but some people manage it. Nate looked down at Pip, who had been unusually still throughout the conversation. The crow met his eyes, and in that moment Nate understood. The pendant with always. The timing of Pip's arrival. The systematic way the bird had led him to the lockbox, to the truth. Helen's parents, he said slowly. Did Helen have any connection to birds? Crows, specifically? Iris's eyebrows rose. How did you know that? Yes, Helen had a crow friend when she was young. Her parents said it followed her everywhere, brought her little gifts. They called it Shadow. Why? Nate gestured to Pip. Because 3 months after my father died, this crow showed up injured at my house. Wouldn't leave. Started bringing me things, including the pendant that led me to all of this. Iris stared at the bird, then at Nate. You're saying, I don't know what I'm saying, but the timing feels like more than coincidence. The drive back to Bayfield felt longer than the journey to Bend. Nate's mind churned with Iris's revelations, while Patricia's journals sat heavy in his lap. Beside him, Zoe dozed against the window, exhausted from the emotional weight of the day. Pip rode quietly in the carrier, occasionally making soft sounds that felt almost conversational. When they arrived home, dusk was settling over the coast. Zoe stirred, blinking awake. You should stay the night, Nate said. It's late. Call your mum, tell her you'll head back tomorrow. Zoe nodded, already pulling out her phone. While she talked to Claire, Nate carried Patricia's journals inside and spread them on the kitchen table. 5 volumes spanning 33 years of his mother's life, not his biological mother, but the woman who'd chosen to be his mother anyway. He opened the second journal, dated 1985. Random entries caught his eye. March 12th. Nate turned 4 today. We had a small party with the neighbors. He asked why Daddy didn't want to play with him. How do I explain that Harold isn't avoiding him, he's avoiding the ghost he sees when he looks at his son's face? July 8th. Found Harold in the garage late at night, looking through the lockbox again. He does this sometimes when he thinks I'm asleep. He's never let go. I knew this when I married him, but knowing and living with it are different things. November 22nd. Nate made a drawing for Harold at school. Father and son holding hands. Harold thanked him, but I found it in the trash later. I saved it. One day, maybe Nate will understand that his father's distance isn't rejection, it's pain. But how do you explain that to a child? Nate had to stop reading. The words were too raw, too close. He pushed the journal away and walked to the window. Outside, the ocean was barely visible in the failing light, waves rolling in with their eternal rhythm. Zoe appeared beside him, 2 mugs of tea in hand. She offered him one without speaking. They stood together in silence until Nate found his voice. She loved me. Of course she did. No. I mean... He struggled for words. I spent so many years thinking Mum was just doing her duty, being responsible, but she chose this, chose me, even knowing Harold's heart was somewhere else. She chose both of you, Zoe said gently. That's what love does sometimes. It chooses the hard thing because it's the right thing. Nate looked at his daughter, surprised by her wisdom. When did you grow up? I've been watching you, Dad. Watching you struggle with Grandpa's distance, watching you repeat the same pattern with me after the divorce. She met his eyes. You disappeared too, just like Grandpa Harold did, not physically but emotionally. Like you were somewhere else, somewhere I couldn't reach. The observation cut deep because it was true. After the divorce, Nate had retreated into numbness. He'd gone through the motions with Zoe, the weekend visits, the awkward dinners, but he hadn't been present. Not really. I'm sorry, he said. I know. But Dad, don't you see? You're doing what Helen asked Harold to do. You're facing it, dealing with it. That's different. Nate returned to the table, pulled the journals toward him again. I need to read all of these. I need to understand what she went through. Want company? They spent the next hours reading together, sometimes aloud, sometimes in silence. Patricia's words painted a portrait of quiet endurance and deep love. She wrote about Nate's childhood milestones with joy and pride. She wrote about Harold's struggles with gentle compassion. And she wrote about her own loneliness with honest pain that never tipped into bitterness. One entry from 1995, when Nate was 14, made him stop breathing. Nate asked me today why Harold never seems happy, why he's always so serious, so distant. I wanted to tell him the truth, that he looks exactly like Helen, moves like her, has her way of tilting his head when he's thinking. That every time Harold looks at him, he sees the woman he lost and the life they never got to have. But how do you tell a child that the very things that make him who he is are also reminders of his father's greatest pain? So I said what I always say, that Daddy loves him very much, he just has trouble showing it. Nate looked at me with those big brown eyes, Helen's eyes, and said, "Maybe I'm just not good enough." I held him while he cried and hated Harold a little in that moment. Hated that his unprocessed grief is poisoning his relationship with his son. Hated that Nate thinks he's the problem when he's never been anything but a gift. Nate set the journal down carefully, his hands shaking. I remember that day. I was in 8th grade. Failed a math test and Harold barely reacted, just nodded and went back to reading his newspaper. I thought he didn't care. He cared, Zoe said. He just didn't know how to show it. They continued reading. The entries grew more poignant as Patricia's cancer diagnosis appeared in 2014. Her writing became less frequent, the handwriting shakier, but the love remained constant. April 3rd, 2015. The doctors say 6 months, maybe less. I'm not afraid of dying, but I'm afraid of leaving Nate without answers. He deserves to know the truth about Helen, about who he really is. But Harold made me promise years ago that we'd never tell him. He was terrified that Nate would resent him, would understand how his distance was about Harold's failures, not Nate's worth. I've kept that promise, but it weighs on me. I've asked Iris to give Nate these journals after I'm gone. Maybe then he'll understand. The final entry was dated 2 weeks before Patricia died. May 15th, 2015. Saw Nate today. He and Claire are struggling, I can see it. He's repeating Harold's patterns, the emotional distance, the inability to be fully present. Grief becomes inheritance if we don't process it. Harold gave Nate his pain instead of his presence, and now Nate is passing that to Zoe. I hope someday he breaks the cycle. I hope he learns that the hardest part of loss isn't saying goodbye. It's learning how to live with what's left behind. And sometimes what's left behind is enough. Sometimes the broken pieces, gathered together with love, can make something beautiful. I pray he discovers that before it's too late. Nate closed the journal, his vision blurred with tears. Those words about loss and what remains, they echoed in his mind. Patricia had understood something fundamental that Harold never learned. She knew, he said. She knew I was heading down the same path Dad did. She tried to warn me. But you're listening now, Zoe said. That's what matters. Outside, full darkness had fallen. Pip was perched on the back of the couch, watching them with those impossibly intelligent eyes. Nate's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then froze. A text from the Astoria Meadows Assisted Living Facility. Mr. Coleman, this is the front desk at Astoria Meadows. We received your letter addressed to Miriam Cordova. Mrs. Cordova has agreed to see you. She asks that you call this number to arrange a visit. Nate stared at the screen. I didn't send a letter to Miriam Cordova. Zoe looked sheepish. I did. After we found out she was alive, I wrote it for you, from you, explained who you are, that you didn't know about her until now. Included a photo of you next to Helen's picture so she could see the resemblance. She paused. I'm sorry if I overstepped. I just thought, what did you say in the letter? That you don't blame her for staying away. That you understand grief makes people do things they wouldn't otherwise do. That you're not asking for anything except a chance to meet her once. To let her see that Helen's son survived and is here and wants to know about his mother. Nate pulled his daughter into a hug. You're extraordinary. You know that? I learned it from watching you, Zoe said into his shoulder. The Astoria Meadows Assisted Living Facility sat on a hillside overlooking the Columbia River. Nate made the drive alone on Tuesday morning, though Pip once again insisted on coming along. The Crow rode in its carrier on the passenger seat, unusually quiet, as if understanding the gravity of the visit. Miriam Cordova had agreed to 1 hour, no promises beyond that. The facility was bright and well-maintained, with large windows letting in autumn light. A nurse at the front desk checked Nate's identification and led him down a carpeted hallway to a small sitting room. Mrs. Cordova prefers to meet here rather than her apartment, the nurse explained. More neutral territory. She's been quite anxious about this visit. So have I. The nurse smiled sympathetically. She's a sweet woman, but she's carried a lot of pain. Please be gentle with her. I will. The nurse left, and Nate sat in one of the comfortable chairs to wait. Pip's carrier rested at his feet. Through the window, he could see the river below, wide and grey under overcast skies. When Miriam Cordova entered, Nate stood immediately. She was tiny, barely 5 feet tall, with dark hair gone silver and eyes that were startlingly familiar. Helen's eyes. His eyes. She stopped just inside the doorway, her face hardening as she took him in. You look like him, she said, her voice tight. I look like her too, Nate replied gently. Your daughter. Something flickered across Miriam's face. Pain, recognition, resistance. She moved slowly to the chair farthest from him and sat with her arms crossed. You have 1 hour, she said. I agreed to this, but I don't know if it was wise. Nate sat back down, keeping his movements careful and non-threatening. Thank you for seeing me. I know this can't be easy. Easy? Her laugh was bitter. You have no idea what you're asking of me. You're right. I don't, but I'm not asking for anything except the chance to know about my mother, about Helen. At her daughter's name, Miriam's rigid posture cracked slightly. Her eyes went to the window, the river beyond. Helen was our only child, she said finally. Our miracle baby. We tried for 10 years before she came along. She was everything bright, beautiful, kind. She loved birds, loved people, loved life with an intensity that made everyone around her happier. Her voice broke. Harold took her from us. The accident wasn't his fault. The police report. He was driving. The words came out sharp, angry. She was in his car. He walked away, and she died. Our daughter, our only child, died giving birth to his baby while he got bruises. Nate let the anger wash over him, didn't defend Harold, didn't argue. He just waited. After a long moment, Miriam continued, quieter now. The last time I spoke to Helen was 3 days before the accident. She called to tell me about the pregnancy, about Harold's proposal. She was so happy, so excited, and I was cold, disapproving, worried that they were rushing into things, that Harold would take her away from us, that she was too young. Tears slipped down her weathered cheeks. My last words to my daughter were cautionary, worried, not loving. I never got to tell her I was happy for her, that she'd be a wonderful mother. She knew you loved her, Nate said softly. Did she? Miriam looked at him directly for the first time. How would you know? Nate reached into his bag and pulled out one of Helen's letters from the lockbox. The one dated November 1981, announcing her pregnancy. Because she wrote this to you, he said, holding it out. She never mailed it. It was found in her apartment after she died. Miriam took the letter with shaking hands. As she read, her face crumbled. Tears fell openly as she traced her daughter's handwriting. I know you worry, but Harold is a good man, and this baby will know love. I hope you'll want to be part of our lives. She read aloud, her voice breaking. If something happens to me, please don't punish Harold. Don't punish our child. Life is too short for that kind of pain. She looked up at Nate, devastated. I punished you both anyway, for 40 years. I didn't listen to what she asked. You were grieving. Grief isn't an excuse for cruelty. She folded the letter carefully, held it against her chest. You're really her son, Helen's baby. Yes, tell me about your life, please. Tell me what I missed. So Nate did. He told her about growing up in Portland, about Patricia who'd raised him, about Harold's emotional distance. He told her about his own failed marriage, about Zoe, about the patterns he was trying to break. He showed her photos on his phone, pictures of Zoe, of his house, of his workshop, and then he told her about Pip. After my father died 3 months ago, an injured crow appeared at my house. It wouldn't leave. I built it a shelter, and it started bringing me gifts. Small things at first, then items that led me to a lockbox my father had hidden. Inside were letters from Helen, photographs, everything I never knew about my mother. Miriam's expression changed. A crow? Yes. Why? This. Helen had a crow friend when she was a child. It followed her everywhere, brought her things, bottle caps, flowers, shiny stones. We called it Shadow. It was with her from age 7 until she moved away for college. Miriam's eyes went to the carrier at Nate's feet. Is that your crow? Nate opened the carrier. Pip hopped out, surveyed the room, then flew to the arm of Miriam's chair. The old woman gasped. Pip tilted its head, looking at her with those bright, knowing eyes, and made a soft sound, almost like a greeting. Shadow, Miriam whispered. You moved just like Shadow. The crow hopped closer, then did something extraordinary. It reached out with one foot and gently touched Miriam's hand, where it rested on the chair arm. The gesture was deliberate, tender, nothing like normal bird behavior. Miriam began to weep. My Helen, my baby girl, you sent him to me, didn't you? Pip made another soft sound, then flew back to Nate's shoulder. The hour passed, then another. Miriam asked questions about Nate's childhood, his interests, his dreams. She shared stories about Helen, her love of music, her terrible cooking, her gift for making people feel seen and valued. She would have been an amazing mother, Miriam said. She loved you before she ever met you. From the moment she knew you existed, you were her whole world. I wish I could have known her. She knew you, though. For 3 days after you were born, she held you. The nurses said she wouldn't let you go, not even to sleep. She sang to you. Miriam stood, moved to a bookshelf in the corner, and pulled down a small wooden box. I've kept this all these years. I should have given it to Harold, but I was too angry. Maybe I was keeping it for you. She handed the box to Nate. Inside was a music box, delicately carved. He wound it carefully, and a lullaby played, sweet and simple and heartbreaking. Helen's grandmother gave this to her. Helen gave it to me for safekeeping before you were born, said she wanted to pass it to her children someday. Miriam's voice was thick with emotion. It should be yours. Nate lifted the music box, felt the weight of generations in his hands, and then he noticed something else in the box, a sealed envelope, yellowed with age. What's this? Miriam leaned closer. I don't know. I've never seen that before. The envelope was addressed in Helen's handwriting, to my parents, to be opened after I'm gone. She must have put it in the music box, Miriam said. All these years it's been there, and I never knew. With shaking hands, Nate opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, dated December 15th, 1981, 3 days before the accident. He read it aloud, his voice unsteady. My dearest Mum and Dad, if you're reading this, something has gone wrong. I wanted to put these words somewhere safe, in case the worst happens. You've always worried about me, and I know my pregnancy has made you worry more. But I need you to know I'm happy, happier than I've ever been. Harold is a good man, and our baby is going to be so loved. Nate paused, gathering himself before continuing. But if I'm not there to say this myself, please know, you must not let grief turn into bitterness. Life is precious and fragile, and we don't control it. What we control is how we love while we're here, and how we honor those we've lost. If something happens to me, please love my baby. Please love Harold. Don't let my absence create more pain. Let it create more love. Because that's what I would want. That's what I'm asking. Promise me you'll choose love over anger. Promise me you'll let my child know their family. Don't let 40 years pass before you realize that living in pain doesn't honor the dead. It only hurts the living. I love you both so much. Always, Helen. The room fell silent, except for Miriam's quiet weeping. 40 years, she whispered. She knew. Somehow she knew I'd waste 40 years being angry instead of loving. Nate moved to kneel beside her chair, took her hand. You're listening now. That's what matters. I've missed so much. Your whole life. Your daughter's life. Then don't miss any more, Nate said. My daughter Zoe would love to meet her great-grandmother. Miriam squeezed his hand, nodding through tears. Yes, yes, please. The weeks that followed transformed Nate's world in ways he hadn't thought possible. Miriam agreed to weekly visits, and Nate began driving to Astoria every Saturday morning. Sometimes Zoe came along, and those visits became something precious, 3 generations reconnecting across a chasm of lost time. Miriam was different than Nate had expected. Beneath the initial anger and pain lay a woman of warmth and gentle humor. She taught Zoe phrases in Spanish, shared recipes that had been passed down through Helen's family, and spoke about Helen with a mix of sorrow and celebration that felt healing rather than heavy. On their 4th visit, Miriam brought out photo albums Nate had never seen. Helen as a baby, a toddler, a young woman, pictures of Helen's childhood home in Portland, of family gatherings, of moments captured and preserved. You have her smile, Miriam said, touching a photograph of Helen at age 20. And her hands, see how long her fingers were? You have those too. Nate studied the photo, seeing himself reflected in his mother's features for the first time. It was disorienting and comforting in equal measure. Zoe leaned over his shoulder. You do look like her dad, the eyes especially. Harold must have seen it every time he looked at you, Miriam said quietly. No wonder it was hard for him. The observation hung in the air. Nate had spent weeks processing his feelings about Harold's anger at the emotional distance, sympathy for the impossible grief, frustration at the waste of it all. He still hadn't sorted through everything, but he was trying. On the drive home that day, Zoe asked the question that had been building. Are you going to visit Mom's grave? Helen's, I mean. Nate had been avoiding that very thought. I don't even know where she's buried. We could ask Miriam. Yeah, Nate said. We could. The following Saturday, Miriam provided the information. Riverside Cemetery, just outside Portland. A small plot in the older section, under an oak tree. I haven't been in years, Miriam admitted. After Carlos died, it became too painful. But I'd like to go. If you'd take me. So they planned it, Nate, Zoe, and Miriam. A trip to visit Helen's grave, 43 years after her death. The morning they left, Pip behaved strangely. The crow had been a constant presence for months now, settling into Nate's life as if it had always been there. But that morning, it flew circles around the truck, cawing with unusual urgency. What's wrong with him? Zoe asked. Nate studied the bird. I think he wants to come. To a cemetery? Apparently. So Pip came along, riding in the carrier in the back seat, unusually agitated. The crow shifted constantly. made soft sounds that weren't quite caws, watched through the carrier's mesh with intense focus. Riverside Cemetery was peaceful, well-maintained, with old trees providing shade over weathered headstones. Miriam directed them to the older section, and they walked slowly across grass, still wet with morning dew. Helen's headstone was simple grey granite, smaller than Nate had expected. Helen Maria Cordova, 1956 to 1981, beloved daughter. Nothing about Harold, nothing about the baby she died bringing into the world, just beloved daughter. We were so angry, Miriam explained. We couldn't bring ourselves to put Harold's name on it, couldn't acknowledge he existed. Looking back, it seemed so petty, so cruel. Nate set down the flowers they'd brought, sunflowers, because Miriam said Helen had loved them. Zoe placed hers beside his father's, and Miriam knelt slowly, her hand resting on the stone. "I'm sorry, Mija," she whispered in Spanish. "I'm so sorry I wasted all this time." Nate opened the carrier, and Pip emerged immediately. The crow hopped onto the ground, moved toward the headstone with deliberate steps. Then it did something that made them all freeze. Pip began to circle the grave. Not randomly, but with clear purpose, 3 slow circles, the bird's head lowered, as if in ritual or reverence. The movement was ancient, meaningful, nothing like normal bird behavior. When the 3rd circle completed, Pip stopped directly in front of the headstone and made a sound unlike any Nate had heard from it before. Not a caw, but something musical, almost like the notes from Helen's music box lullaby. "Dios mío," Miriam breathed. Shadow used to do that. When Helen's grandmother died, Shadow flew to the grave and circled it 3 times. Helen said it was the bird's way of saying goodbye. Pip hopped forward and placed something on top of the headstone. Then the crow spread its wings and lifted into the air, circling higher and higher until it caught a wind current and began flying south, away from the cemetery. Nate called out, but the bird didn't return. Within moments it was just a dark speck against the cloudy sky, then gone entirely. "Dad?" Zoe's voice was shaken. "What did it leave?" Nate stepped forward, his heart pounding. On top of Helen's headstone sat a small silver locket, tarnished with age. Miriam gasped. "That's Helen's locket, the one we buried her with. She wore it always. It had pictures of Carlos and me inside. We put it in the casket with her." "That's not possible," Zoe said. But there it was. Nate picked it up with trembling fingers. The locket was warm, as if recently held. He opened it carefully. Inside were 2 tiny photographs, a younger Carlos and Miriam, smiling at the camera. "How?" Miriam whispered. "We buried her with that. I saw them close the casket. It was on her neck." Beneath the locket, previously invisible, was another envelope, smaller than the others, sealed with wax that had somehow survived 43 years of weather and time. The envelope was addressed in Helen's handwriting, "To Harold, with all my love." Nate's hands shook as he picked it up. "This wasn't here a moment ago." "Open it," Miriam said. "Please." The wax seal broke easily, as if it had been waiting for this moment. Inside was a single page, Helen's handwriting clear and strong. Nate read aloud, his voice breaking. "My dearest Harold, if you're reading this, something has gone terribly wrong. I wanted to put these words on paper because I never say them enough. You are the love of my life. This child we're bringing into the world is the greatest gift I could imagine. But Harold, if I'm not there to say this myself, you must not carry guilt. Life is precious and fragile, and we don't control it. What we control is how we love while we're here." He paused, struggling to continue. "Promise me. You'll live fully. You'll love our child with your whole heart. You'll let yourself be happy again, even if I'm not there to share it. Don't let grief make you a ghost. Our baby needs a father who is present, not haunted. I release you from any promises we made, from any pain my absence might cause. Live, Harold. Love again if you find it. Smile again. That's what I want. Nate's voice dropped to barely a whisper for the final lines. Tell our child I loved them before I even knew their face. And tell them you loved them enough for both of us. That has to be enough. Always yours, Helen. The letter fluttered in Nate's shaking hands. Everything Harold should have done, hadn't done. Every instruction he'd failed to follow. Live fully. Love completely. Be present, not haunted. Harold had done the opposite. Had spent 34 years as a ghost, letting grief steal his capacity for presence, for joy, for connection with the son who'd needed him. She was 25 years old, Miriam said, tears streaming down her face. How was she so wise? Zoe held onto Nate's arm, grounding him. He looked at where Pip had disappeared into the sky. Understanding now what the bird had been messenger, guide, Helen's love made manifest to lead him here, to this moment, to these words he needed to hear. They stood in silence at Helen's grave, the weight of her words settling over them like snow. Nate read the letter again, then a third time, each reading revealing new layers of meaning. She knew, he said finally. She knew exactly what Harold would do. She was trying to save him from himself. Miriam reached out, touched the letter gently. But he didn't listen. He couldn't. No, Nate agreed. He couldn't. Zoe knelt beside the headstone, studying the locket that had impossibly appeared. How did this happen? It's not logical. None of this is logical. Does it need to be? Miriam's voice was soft. Some things exist beyond logic. Love, grief, the ways the dead reach out to the living when we need them most. Nate thought about the past 3 months. Pip arriving injured and insistent, the systematic gifts leading him to the lockbox, the pendant with its worn inscription, each step carefully orchestrated to bring him here, to this cemetery, to these words from a mother he'd never known, but who had loved him fiercely. She wanted me to understand, he said, not just about Harold's grief, but about my own patterns, about what I was doing to Zoe. He turned to his daughter, seeing her clearly, perhaps for the first time in years. I've been Harold, emotionally absent, living as a ghost, passing the same pain down to you that he passed to me. Zoe's eyes filled with tears. Dad, no, let me say this, please. He took her hands. Your grandfather's grief made him unable to be present for me, and my unprocessed pain from him, from the divorce, from everything I never dealt with, made me unable to be present for you. Helen's letter wasn't just for Harold, it was for me too. Stop being a ghost. Stop letting grief steal my life. You're here now, Zoe said. That's what matters. But how much time did I waste? How many moments did I miss because I was trapped in my own numbness? Miriam spoke, her voice carrying hard-won wisdom. You can't get back lost time. Believe me, I know. But you can choose differently going forward. That's what Helen is asking, what she asked Harold, and what she's asking you now. Choose life. Choose presence. Choose love, even when it's hard. Nate looked down at Helen's letter, at her clear, strong handwriting. Tell our child I loved them before I even knew their face. I wish I could have known you, he said to the headstone. I wish you'd been there. But thank you for this, for caring enough to reach out across 40 years to teach me what my father never learned. A breeze moved through the cemetery, rustling the oak leaves above them. For just a moment, Nate could swear he smelled something floral and sweet, completely out of place in late autumn, but undeniably there. Gardenias, Miriam whispered. Helen's favorite perfume. The scent faded as quickly as it had come, but it left something behind, a sense of peace, of benediction, of a mother's love, reaching across the impossible distance between life and death. They stayed at the grave another hour, each lost in their own thoughts. Miriam told stories about Helen's childhood, her stubbornness, her laughter, her gift for bringing people together. Nate shared what he'd learned from Patricia's journals, how she'd loved him despite knowing his heart belonged to someone else. Zoe talked about her school project on family history, how much she'd learned about complicated love and chosen family. When they finally prepared to leave, Nate noticed something that made him stop. The grass around the headstone, which had been trampled and worn when they arrived, now showed small green shoots pushing through new growth in the exact pattern where Pip had circled the grave 3 times. "That's not possible," Zoe said, kneeling to examine the growth. "That's fresh grass, like it just sprouted." "Today is a day for impossible things," Miriam said with a small smile. On the drive back to Astoria, they were quiet, each processing the morning's events. When Nate dropped Miriam at her facility, she hugged him tightly. "Visit next week?" she asked. "Every week," Nate promised. "For as long as you'll have us." "Good. And bring Patricia's journals next time. I'd like to read them, if you don't mind. She was a better woman than I was. She chose love, while I chose anger. I want to understand her better." After leaving Miriam, Nate drove toward the coast, with Zoe beside him. The October sky was clearing, patches of blue breaking through the clouds. "Do you think Pip is really gone?" Zoe asked. "I think Pip did what it came to do." "Do you think it was really Shadow, or Helen's spirit, or just a really smart bird?" Nate considered the question. "I don't know. Maybe all 3, maybe none. Maybe it doesn't matter as much as what it taught me." They drove in comfortable silence until Zoe spoke again. "Mum called me yesterday. She knows about everything. I've been keeping her updated. She wanted me to tell you something." "What?" "That she's proud of you. For doing the hard work, for facing all of this instead of running from it." Zoe paused. "And she said she's sorry too, for giving up on you. She said she should have fought harder to help you break through your walls instead of just leaving." The words landed gently, without the sharp edges of blame or recrimination. "Tell her I understand. Tell her I don't blame her. She waited longer than anyone should have to. I already did. But maybe you could tell her yourself. She said she'd like to talk to you. Really talk, not just the logistics stuff about me." "Yeah," Nate said. "I'd like that." When they arrived home, the house felt different. Not empty, but quiet in a peaceful way. Nate stood on the back porch, looking at the shelter he'd built for Pip months ago. The crow was gone, but the shelter remained a reminder of an impossible journey. Zoe joined him, leaning against the railing. "What are you thinking about?" "About what Helen wrote, that the hardest part of loss is learning to live with what's left behind. I've spent my whole life thinking that meant learning to live with absence, with what's missing. But maybe it means something different." "What?" "Maybe it means learning to live with what remains, the love that's still here, even when the person isn't, the connections that survive death, the lessons they leave behind." He looked at his daughter. "You're what remains from my marriage, the good thing that came from it. And I almost lost you by being a ghost like Harold was." Zoe hugged him. "But you didn't lose me. I'm right here." They stood together as the sun began its descent toward the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called just a normal crow, going about its normal crow business. But Nate chose to hear it as a blessing. That evening, after Zoe left for Portland, Nate sat at his kitchen table with Patricia's journals spread before him. He'd avoided reading the final volumes, afraid of what he might find, but Helen's words had given him courage. He opened the journal from 2010, 5 years before Patricia's death. An entry from April caught his attention. "Nate's getting divorced. Claire called me today, heartbroken. She said Nate won't talk to her, won't open up, just retreats into himself whenever things get difficult. I see Harold's patterns repeating. Emotional distance becomes inheritance. I don't know how to help him break free of it." Nate closed his eyes against the truth of it. Patricia had seen it happening, had tried to warn him in her own quiet way, but he'd been too numb to hear. He flipped ahead, finding an entry from 2014, shortly after her diagnosis. The cancer is aggressive. 6 months, maybe less. I keep thinking about all the things I should have done differently, should have told Nate the truth about Helen years ago, should have insisted Harold get therapy, deal with his grief, should have fought harder for both of them. But I chose peace over honesty, and now Nate is paying the price. He deserves to know who he really is, who he came from. Maybe then he can understand that his father's distance was never about his worth. The final pages were harder to read. Patricia's handwriting had deteriorated as the illness progressed, but her love remained clear in every line. The last entry, written in a shaky hand just days before she died: "I hope Nate finds these journals someday. I hope he learns that love isn't always romantic or passionate or equal. Sometimes love is just showing up, day after day, choosing someone even when it's hard. I chose Harold and Nate, and I don't regret it. But I hope Nate chooses differently. I hope he learns to be present before it's too late. I hope he breaks the cycle." Nate set the journal down, his chest tight. Patricia had loved him completely, without reservation, even knowing she was second choice to a ghost. That kind of love deserved to be honored. He pulled out his phone and called Claire. She answered on the second ring. "Nate, is everything okay?" "Yeah, I just..." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "Zoe said you wanted to talk." "Really talk?" There was a brief silence. "I do. But I wasn't sure you'd want to." "I want to. I need to, actually." He took a breath. "I owe you an apology. A real one. Not just for the divorce, but for the marriage. For all the years I wasn't really present. For making you feel alone, even when I was sitting right next to you." "Nate, please, let me finish. I've been Harold my whole adult life. Emotionally absent, trapped in my own head, unable to connect. And you waited for me to break through it. You waited years, and I just kept staying numb. You deserve so much better than that." Claire's voice was soft when she spoke. "Thank you for saying that. I waited because I kept hoping you'd find your way back. But after a while I realized you didn't even know you were lost. I know now. I'm working on it. Not for us. I know we're done, and that's okay. But for Zoe, for myself, for the people I might still have a chance with." "I'm glad," Claire said, and she sounded like she meant it. "You deserve to be happy, Nate, to really be present in your own life. And for what it's worth, I'm sorry too. Sorry for giving up. Sorry I didn't know how to reach you. You tried. That's more than enough. You tried for 15 years. They talked for another hour, the first honest conversation they'd had in years. Not about logistics or custody schedules, but about what had gone wrong, what they'd learned, how they could do better as Zoe's parents even if they couldn't be partners anymore. When they hung up, Nate felt lighter. Not happy exactly, but clearer. Like a fog had lifted. He walked to the back porch, where Pip's empty shelter sat on the railing. The night was clear, stars brilliant above the dark ocean. He thought about Helen, about Patricia, about Harold, 3 people bound together by love and grief and choices made in impossible circumstances. Helen had asked Harold to live fully, to be present, to let go of guilt. He'd failed, but the message had survived, carried forward by a mysterious crow and a collection of letters, reaching Nate exactly when he needed it most. His phone buzzed. A text from Zoe. "Mom said you called. Thank you, Dad, for everything, for being brave enough to change. Love you." Nate typed back. "Love you too, kiddo. See you this weekend. Let's build something together." 3 dots appeared, then... Like what? A birdhouse. For the garden. Perfect. Nate set his phone aside and looked up at the stars. Somewhere out there, Pip was flying, or whatever Pip had become. Shadow, Helen's spirit, a messenger between worlds. Or just a remarkably intelligent crow with inexplicable timing. It didn't matter which. What mattered was the journey, the healing, the hard truths faced, and the harder choice to change. Movement caught his eye. A crow landed on the garden fence, not Pip. This bird was younger, sleeker. It hopped along the rail, tilted its head at Nate, then dropped something shiny on the porch before flying away. Nate walked over and picked it up. A bottle cap, simple and ordinary. The kind of gift crows brought to people they liked. He smiled, slipping it into his pocket. Maybe it was just a crow. Or maybe Helen was reminding him that love persists, that connection continues, that the dead speak to us in ways both ordinary and miraculous. Either way, he was listening now. He was present now. And that, finally, was enough. 3 months later, early spring transformed the Oregon coast. Nate's garden, once overgrown and neglected, now flourished with new growth. Rows of vegetables stretched toward the fence he'd finally repaired. Flower beds bloomed with colors. Patricia would have loved yellow daffodils, purple crocuses, the first brave tulips pushing through soil still cool from winter. Zoe came every weekend now, not out of custody obligation but genuine desire. Together they'd planted the garden, turned soil, pulled weeds, created something living and beautiful from what had been abandoned. This Saturday morning found them in the workshop, wood shavings curling at their feet as they put finishing touches on a birdhouse. Zoe had designed it bright colors Helen had loved, learned from stories Miriam shared. Nate provided the craftsmanship, teaching his daughter the same skills Harold had once taught him. "Pass me the sandpaper?" Zoe asked, focused on smoothing a rough edge. Nate handed it over, watching her work with the same careful attention to detail he brought to his own projects. She'd inherited that from him, or maybe from Harold, or maybe from Helen, these threads of family weaving through generations, regardless of biology. "Miriam's coming for dinner tonight," Nate said. "She wants to bring some of Helen's old recipes, says it's time you learned to make her abuela's tamales." "I'd like that." Zoe glanced up, smiling. "You know what's weird? I feel closer to Grandpa Harold now than I ever did when he was alive. Learning about Helen, understanding his grief, it makes him make sense." "Yeah," Nate agreed. "It does." They'd visited Harold's grave the previous week, Nate and Zoe and Miriam together. Nate had brought Helen's letter, read it aloud at his father's headstone, then tucked it beneath a stone to hold it in place. "You tried, Dad," he'd said to the grave. "You just didn't have the tools to do what Helen asked, but I'm going to try for both of us." Miriam visited monthly now, staying for long weekends. She and Nate had developed an easy relationship built on shared love for Helen's memory and genuine affection for each other. She'd become grandmother to Zoe, great-grandmother in truth, but grandmother in practice, teaching her Spanish and family recipes and stories about Helen that kept her daughter's memory alive in ways that celebrated rather than mourned. The birdhouse complete, they carried it to the garden and hung it where Pip's shelter had been. The old shelter Nate had kept, moved to the workshop as a reminder. "Do you think another crow will come?" Zoe asked. "Maybe, maybe not. Either way, it's here if they need it." Mrs. Hendricks appeared at the fence, pruning shears in hand, her universal signal for wanting to chat. "That's a beautiful birdhouse," she called. "Your work?" "Joint effort," Nate said. "Zoe's design, my carpentry. Even better." "Mrs." Hendricks smiled at them both. "The garden looks wonderful too. Patricia would be pleased. She always said this yard had good bones, just needed someone to care for it." "I'm trying," Nate said. "More than trying. Succeeding." She paused, then added, "My late husband used to say, the measure of a life well lived isn't perfection. It's the willingness to keep trying after you fail. You're doing that, Nate. Your father never did. But you are." After she went back to her own yard, Zoe asked, "Do you still think about him? Grandpa Harold?" "Every day. But differently now. I understand him better, which makes me less angry but also sadder for him. He had this beautiful son, me, and he couldn't see it because he was trapped in what he'd lost. What a waste." "But you're not wasting it," Zoe said. "You're here. You're present. That matters. That evening, they gathered around Nate's kitchen table. Nate, Zoe, Miriam, and surprisingly, Claire. The ex-wife and the grandmother meeting for the first time, united by love for the girl who connected them. Miriam had brought ingredients for tamales, and they worked together, hands moving through the ancient rhythm of spreading masa, adding filling, folding corn husks. Helen's music box played softly in the background, the lullaby that connected 3 generations. Helen would have loved this, Miriam said, watching them work. She always dreamed of a big family, everyone together in the kitchen. She has it, Zoe said. Just took a while to arrange. After dinner, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the ocean in shades of gold and rose, a crow landed on the new birdhouse. Not Pip. This bird was clearly different, younger. It hopped along the roof, examined the structure with interest, then flew down to the porch railing. It dropped something small and shiny at Nate's feet, a button, worn smooth with age. "They remember," Zoe said softly. "Yes," Nate agreed. "They remember, and so do we." The crow took flight as the sun touched the horizon, its wings dark against the brilliant sky. Nate picked up the button, added it to the collection. He'd started small gifts from wild creatures who somehow understood gratitude, connection, the invisible threads that bind us to each other and to the past. He thought about Helen's words, "The hardest part of loss is learning to live with what's left behind." He'd spent so long thinking that meant surviving absence, enduring emptiness. But he understood now. What remained was love, messy and complicated, passed through Patricia's journals and Helen's letters, through Miriam's stories and Harold's failures, through Pip's mysterious guidance and Zoe's patient presence. What remained was enough. More than enough. The broken pieces, gathered together with care and love, had made something new, something beautiful, something that honored the past while living fully in the present. And that, finally, was exactly what Helen had asked for all along.